Hey, welcome back everyone to the second part of this market failure essay question 1 lecture. For this part of the lecture, I'll be going through part B of this essay. So before I start, I will quickly run through the preamble and how it's relevant to part B, and then we'll start writing our essay, okay? So when I read the question, evaluate the policies that could be adopted by governments to address both these types of market failures. So straight away, right, I'm quite happy because my part B is actually a relatively simple question. It is just a policy question, right? To address both these types of market failures. So I know that my key argument 1 and key argument 2 is very straight cut. My key argument 1 maybe for R&D, and my key argument 2 I would write for market dominance. Okay? So for this question, let's read the preamble first. Generally, this sounds very simple, right? But if they have given us policies to use, we must use them. So you see, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed severe underinvestment in research and development, in R&D, to prevent public health crises. Policymakers have attempted to issue patents and grants. These are two policies already, patents and grants, for pharmaceutical companies to encourage discoveries. This discoveries here is just your R&D. The rights to manufacture are held by a small group making extraordinary profits results. So this one, they didn't give us a policy for market dominance, but they did give us two policies for R&D. Okay, so before I write, I'll go through three key arguments. Okay, so generally you only need to write two, but I want to go through two for the R&D because I want to show you that it actually shifts different parts of the graph. Okay, so for my key argument 1 for the market, right? Wait, let me see if I can split up the paper. Okay, never mind, I don't need this. I'll just draw a line across. So you can write either or. Okay, for key argument 1, for I would write about the grants to engage in R&D. So my key argument 1, I would say grants to encourage R&D. Because here is a policies question, right? I know I just have to use my OWL framework. I just spam OWL, and then after that I would be able to get most of my content marks already, right? So I won't delve into the W part or the L part, okay? Because by now I think we are all very confident with these market failure strategies. What I want to bring everyone through is the drawing of the graph. Okay, so here you realize that for this graph, we would start off with the normal graph, right? Which is what we have over here. This is the one that we drew for from the first part, right? And PC equals to okay, and then I draw something like that. Okay, so then we will have this is Q private. This is Q social, right? So when I say give grants, right, we have to be very sensitive to what they're saying. It is actually telling us that this grants, right, is meant to what? It's meant to lower the cost of production of engaging in R&D, right? Basically, I'm giving you money to engage in R&D. Maybe initially the R&D will have cost about $10 million, but now that I give you $5 million, you realize that you only need to fork out an additional $5 million to engage in R&D. So when I say grants to encourage R&D, the line that shifts, right, is actually making your marginal private costs lower. Correct? Because at the start, we defined the private cost to be the monetary cost of engaging in R&D. So when they give us grants, right, the firm actually has to spend less monetary costs, the private cost for the firm decreases. So MPC shifts down. And then if you don't know where to shift to, right, you just draw it such that MPC cuts MPB at the socially optimal output, because that's the idea, right? So I'll have this point, and then I'll just draw a parallel line over here, and then I'll write MPC prime equals to MPC plus sub. So you see there's a downward shift in my MPC, and so initially my deadweight loss of this area, this black area over here, is completely eliminated because now I'm producing at QS. So the workings of the policy I won't delve into deeply, but what I want to focus on, right, is that they would usually provide a per unit sub equal to the MEB at QS. And here, this one, because the subsidy causes fall in MCOP, which would lead to a fall in MPC from MPC to MPC prime. Okay? So here's the key thing. After I say this, right, a lot of you will just jump straight into telling me, hence, now they will produce at the socially optimal outcome. No, we have to realize that with or without the subsidies, they do not care about the external benefits, right? That is what external benefits are defined as. As consumers, as producers, as rational economic agents, we don't care whether or not there are external benefits. The only thing that changes, right, is that there's a new private optimal equilibrium, right? At the end of the day, the firms are still self-interested. So we have to tell them that there's a new private optimal equilibrium formed at where MPC prime equals to MPB at output. So this I'll write QP prime. At output, QP prime, Q equals to QP prime, QP prime. And then, which happens to coincide with QS. Which happens to coincide with QS. So this is the focus that I want to bring about for this whole thing, right? We cannot say that just because I have a subsidy, suddenly the firms care about the external benefits. They don't care. They still care about their private benefits and their private costs. It just so happens that the shift in their private benefit or private cost, right, leads to their new equilibrium being formed in a point that coincides with the socially optimal outcome. It doesn't mean that they care about the socially outcome, okay? So we must get that very clear. And then after that, this is my WL, and then after that, my limitation. The very simple one, I'll always just, for for taxes or subsidies, I'll just write imperfect info, maybe can lead to government failure. Now, for an alternative key argument one, right, this is the one I want to bring about. We can also talk about patterns. You can choose either one. So when I draw the graph for patterns, okay. Okay, I'll keep it short. The graph is generally like that, right? A positive externality graph. So what I want to focus on, right, is the difference between these two graphs. You realize that here is a fall in MPC, right? But when I give firms a patent, what happens? So firms are not incentivized because to undertake R&D, because initially without a patent, if I research something and I discover something incredible, other firms who are competing with me, maybe they never even thought about this method. Maybe they didn't even have the money or the time to invest in inventing something new, right? But now they can just rip me off and steal my product. And because they can steal my product, you realize that I cannot sell it as high as I could have in the start, because now a lot of other firms will produce close substitutes to what I invested in. So when I give patents, right, what I'm actually shifting is the marginal private benefit. The private benefit of R&D increase, right? Why? Because you realize at the start, right, we define the benefit as the revenue the firm can gain from if the R&D is successful. So you realize, right, without a patent, if my R&D is successful, other firms can copy it, right? So the demand, let's say R&D, I produce a new good and a new product, okay, is revolutionary. So initially I can sell it for a very, very, very high price and I'll earn a lot of money because nothing else in the market compares to what I have. But without a patent, right, everybody else from all over the world, all the other competing firms can copy or try to recreate what my firm has researched and what my firm has produced. So, and if they all decide to copy and they all decide to sell, I cannot charge as high because the demand for my product will become much more price elastic, right? So by giving patents, it's kind of promising the firms that, hey, whatever you find will be yours. Okay, so the marginal private benefit of R&D will increase. And it will increase to MSB. So I just write MSB equals to MPB prime, and then I'll write here is QP prime. So you see, the key difference here, right, is that when I use a grant, I am shifting the cost of production. So you see, when I shift the cost of production, my MPC falls. But on the second part, when I shift the amount of revenue my firms can earn, right, my MPB falls. So you don't have to memorize what shifts where. You just look at how you define your different curves, right, your different lines on the graph, and you realize that the shifting becomes actually quite intuitive. So when I shift this, I won't go through the OWL, right? The focus is, it is more beneficial for, so there's more beneficial for firms to engage in R&D. For firms to engage in R&D, so this will lead to, is reflected by MPB increase from MPB to MPB prime, right? And then here, we same thing as here, they still don't care about externality, but there will be a new private optimal equilibrium, new private optimal equilibrium at MPB prime equals to MPC prime, not MPC, at QP prime, correct? At Q equals QP prime, which coincides with QS. See, my explanation is always same, very consistent, which coincides with the socially optimal output of QS, right? Hence, deadweight loss is eliminated. So for the more analytical, the longer approach, obviously you still refer to your notes and make sure you all write out everything in full. Here, the next thing, the limitation, right? The limitation of it, when it comes to a pattern, right? Pattern's very, very specific, okay? So very rarely we'll have patterns. Usually it's for research only, but the limitation is that it's just the consequence of having a temporary monopoly. So why do I say temporary monopoly? For two reasons. One, patents expire. And why I use the word monopoly? Because when the patents, so long they don't expire, so for a period of time, the firms can behave like one, right? Why? Because it sells a completely unique good. Nobody else in the market can fight with them. So it can actually worsen the market dominance if they choose to raise prices a lot, blah, blah, blah. And it can also, because of this monopolistic style of hoarding information, right? It can also hamper future innovation, maybe because other firms don't have this knowledge that this firm has. So the lack of knowledge will make it difficult for other smaller firms to engage in R&D also. Okay, so you can choose either one for your key argument. And then for your key argument 2, to address market dominance, right? This one is a little bit more cursory because personally there isn't much diagrams to draw for it. And even if there are, it's not as analytical as what we have up here. Okay, so the first one I will always talk about for market dominance is always legislation. More specifically, either a competition act or an antitrust law. So these forms of legislation, right, we need same thing, we use our OWL framework, just that we don't have a graph this time. It is meant to increase competition, right? And when I increase competition, it is to prevent forming of monopolies or collusive oligopolies that can behave like monopolies. So why I want to prevent formation of such big entities which have a very large market share and market power, right, is I want to prevent super duper large firms, prevent very large firms from abusing their market power. To restrict global supply of vaccine. I just write restrict supply, but it's restrict supply to global supply to vaccines and also everything. So if they are able to abuse their market power, you can see they can restrict output even more, right? It can actually worsen the underproduction. So if I introduce a competition act or antitrust laws, you can see that an increase in competition would likely lead to us producing more and maybe closer to the socially optimal output. So that is the main gist of how this works. And then the limitation is that because of these anti-competition acts, right, maybe all firms are not allowed to merge and everything. Firms not allowed to merge. So maybe even for the smaller firms, right, they cannot merge, they cannot collude, they cannot work together. What happens? They cannot reap sufficient IEOS, right? They can't reap sufficient internal EOS, and because they don't have any cost savings, because their output is very small and they're not allowed to merge with people, they're not allowed to collude with people, you realize that because they don't reap EOS, their costs are still high, they cannot pass cost savings to consumers. So prices might be higher. The prices of the vaccine. For this, if you want to draw a graph, you can. You would just reflect it as a fall in demand for firms that are already there, right? Because more competition, assuming the goods they sell are close enough substitutes, there will be a fall in demand becomes more price elastic. The problem is when you draw this graph, right, you have to practice it a lot. In a sense, you cannot, unless you plan for it to be so, right, it's actually very difficult to show that your new output after a fall in demand will actually be closer to the socially optimal output than it was before. So you actually need to try and plan it, practice it, if you want to draw this diagram, okay? For the last point, this one I won't focus too much on it. So an alternative KA2, which I wouldn't usually write, is just nationalization. Nationalization simply just means the government take over production. Because they are not driven by profits, they will just want to provide socially optimal. But then similarly, right, for every single thing, when government does something, the limitation is the same. Because they are not profit maximizing, they don't care as much about how much profits they are making, right? So it will always be inefficient, right? They don't maximize profits. Okay, maybe I'll be more specific. It'll be X inefficient. It could also be dynamically inefficient because they have no willingness or ability to go and undertake more research, right? The only thing that might be better is that it will be closer to allocative efficiency. But then when it comes to managing and everything, they have no incentive to produce at lowest cost, no incentive to earn maximum profits. They will always be very inefficient. Now, for the evaluative conclusion, right? For this part, the evaluative synthesis, you realize that this question is very, very nice with the synthesis because they just want to evaluate the policies. So how I would evaluate the policies, so you would just say whether or not they are sufficient. So first of all, we try and lean back to what we learned from the ATMS framework, right? Assumptions, time frame, magnitude, situation. We would lean back on whether or not the policies are good enough or not. Policies can solve the market failure. And then we look at this S over here, right? Situation and magnitude. The situation they give you now is what? COVID-19 crisis. Correct? So in a COVID-19 crisis, right, maybe you could say that governments face tight budget constraints because they really have to spend so much money giving out grants and everything. Maybe a grant might not make sense. Maybe my nationalization might not make sense because the government may be in a budget deficit, or they may be doing poorly on their fiscal balance. So it will not be realistic for them to continue handing out money, right? So because of the COVID-19 crisis, maybe they have the budget, maybe they have a budget deficit, okay? I'll write that. Possible budget deficit because of all the grants they give out. So because of this, right, maybe you can say that grants are not as realistic or even sustainable. So I would focus on patterns first. And then you need to see, right, that you need to compare across the country. Not across the country, sorry, across the different types of market failure, right? But you realize also, if I evaluate, right, if I have patterns, right, you realize that the ability to retain their supernormal profits, the ability for these firms here, these small number of pharmaceutical companies, right, to continue to restrict supply is even higher. So you need to address this clash. The clash with solving market dominance. And then for market dominance, very simply, we'll probably look at Competition Act, right? So you'll probably have to increase level of competition a lot to reduce the market share or the market power that these firms have, so that everyone is able to have a fair fight. Or not say fair fight lah. Consumers get lower prices, there's more R&D, everyone's happy, there's less COVID, right? And also, beyond just the whether or not the policies are able to resolve the market failure, we also need to look at the type of country they are in. It depends on the country. And this applies for both, right? Because you realize at the end of the day, right, when I'm doing patterns, when I'm doing legislation, right, it depends largely on ability to regulate. Every single policy depends on this ability to regulate. Even my grants, right? Maybe if I give them one lump sum payment, am I able to regulate how they spend the money? When I give patents, am I able to ensure that no other firm copies what they're doing? Am I able to ensure that I can enforce this patent so that people trust the government when they say it's patented? And lastly, even for a Competition Act, everything, am I able to ensure that firms do not collude secretly to drive this increased competition out? So at the end of the day, it depends on the type of country. So you see, I have two different angles of evaluation, and when I elaborate them all the way, you realize that I actually have a more than substantial evaluation for 5 marks already. So for this question, right, even though I know that we always tell you to write 2 key arguments now, personally, if I have the time, or if you have the time, right, for A-levels, I will write grants, legislation, and patents. For the very simple reason, right, because I write grants and legislation to show the scope, to show that I'm answering the question, because I want to address both these types of market failure. But I write patents because first, I want to show off the knowledge to the examiner that, look, I can tell that they shift different things. That's one thing. Second thing I want to reflect to the examiner is that I understand that these two policies are completely different. If you don't have time to do it in an A-level exam, don't stress over it, just write 2 key arguments. But if you have more than enough time, that's personally what I would suggest you to do. Okay, I'll give you a bit of time to take a screenshot of this. And if not, that'll be all for the first market failure essay lecture. And I'll see you guys in the other lectures. Okay, bye bye.